if miniatures were your hardware and then the game was the software, sort of like a cartridge plugging into a old game system.
My name's Andrew. I go by Master Blaster on Discord. I've been designing games on and off for probably about 7 years now.
I'm Trey. My Discord name is just 4eyes. I've been designing games for probably like 10, mostly for like my local gaming group.
And I'm Ryan. I am Old Greg on Discord. I've been helping others design games and kind of get things over the finish line for last 3 or 4 years here, plus, all sorts of things in the cooker, working on a very big project right now with my core gaming group that maybe one day we'll publish. Looking forward to it.
In my interview with Turnup 28 Max, he used this term models Gnostic. And the joke he was making was that, like, he wanted Turnup, which has a very distinct style, to have to care about what the models look like and actually be deeply invested in the model aesthetics, but still be able to escape the sort of like restrictions that are imposed when you play a game like that's developed by a big company, like your Games Workshop games, your Marvel Crisis Protocols or whatever, where there's actually like it's almost like they restrict you so much where they're like extracting rent from your play by forcing you to buy models within their system to play in their like official programming. And so it's like, I was really excited by this models Gnostic concept that Max brought up, because it kind of really resonates with what I'm looking for in models agnosticism, which is to still create like a rich aesthetic experience, but not be forced to do the WYSIWYG thing.
Yeah, I think one of the current kind of trends that I've seen, Turnup is a great example of this, right? I think another one I've seen really kind of emerging over the last couple of years is Mordheim, right? Mordheim is an old Games Workshop game. If you're into mini wargaming, I'm sure you've heard of it. If not, look it up. It's cool. But one of the big things that game kind of drove was, altering the minis that you had for your warband, making your warband unique. And as time went on and that game was dropped by Games Workshop, people still played it. As it's kind of re-emerging, you search Mordheim today, you see all sorts of warbands. There are collections of minis that people are using to play that are not Games Workshop minis, and in some cases don't resemble anything like what the kind of original vision was, but they still somehow kind of hold to the aesthetic of Mordheim, right? It's people kind of imbuing their own take on the art and the vibe that game talks about. And I get a huge kick out of seeing things new and seeing the creativity people bring to the floor. So I think it's a huge part of our community and super important to allow people that creative freedom to bring what they think is cool to the table and really tell a story with it. And then, with your 2 armies or your 4 armies or whatever war bands, you can really start to craft that narrative together using whatever rule set and whatever minis. The idea is, I think it really imbues a lot of that passion.
Like when I first heard of minis agnostic gaming, my thought was like it was just like a spectrum between using Games Workshop's models to play Warhammer or like using a cup that you just found in your kitchen to represent a dreadnought. And And then once I started, which I think is like an interesting spectrum, like in terms of like where you can like completely abstract out the aesthetic part of the game. And then once I started to see the sort of economic dimension of like, hey, it's really expensive to just buy. Like, if you want to play more time with the original figures, you have to go on eBay and buy the really expensive retro minis that you have to like really spend a lot of energy just to even find the right set of them. And then they're going to be expensive. And then I think that sort of economics works in just like whether or not you're going to play with the like strictly defined pieces for the game. And then there's like that other dimension of like creating a shared aesthetic. And I think the people who are doing more time right now are like all doing such a good job of, and I'm just agreeing with what you said earlier, of just generating this unified aesthetic where people from like all over the US and different countries are like sharing these images of like stuff that they're making out of like different miniature kits, random pieces of garbage they find, and making these just like really beautiful game objects. I think an interesting thing that somebody used to describe this way of approaching gaming is like if miniatures were your hardware and then the game was the software, sort of like a cartridge plugging into a old game system. And I thought,
I love that concept.
So yeah, I think one thing that I think you've both touched on a little bit that really really fascinates me about models agnostic games is that, so when we look at, you know, something like Turnip 28 or Gaslands, what the game still has to bring you something, right? There's a reason that people prefer certain games over others. You know, the reason that, people play, Warhammer instead of something like, I don't know, backgammon. I think I mentioned backgammon earlier. I'm on a backgammon kick. Is really, in a large part, this framing, right? There is a degree of mechanical complexity, but there are other games that are certainly mechanically complex that are played less than mini war games overall. And I think that framing is important. And I think in the same way that games can bring sort of generic framing to certain verbs, right? They can say, this is a game where, you kill things. This is a game where you do this, that, and the other, right? I think games can also create a sort of pastiche of nouns, right? These are the things that exist within the scope of this game. And so I think that's something that's really crucial to a lot of models agnostic games. Like, you look at the ones that are successful, it's games that give you a lot of kind of grist for that creative mill, right? What they give you is not only rules, but a really, really clear and compelling aesthetic domain that's not limiting, but has clear sort of like symbolic connotations and a clear sort of form language and stuff like that. I don't want to get to a place where I'm like naming unsuccessful models agnostic games, but they are out there. And that tends to be what I find is like the reason I personally don't pick them up, for example, is because I look at, what's on offer, and it might be a really excellent rule system. It might be some interesting enough writing and framing, but without that kind of aesthetic anchor, right? Without saying that I know that the person I'm playing with agrees with me on, what we're imagining collectively. It just, it doesn't, it doesn't light my fire, because otherwise
it's a strong hook, right? Like you're hooked into a game or you're not. Yeah.
Well, I think in particular that hook needs to be imaginative. It can't just be, this is a game where we make, we play a certain type of story. It needs to also say like, this is what the characters in that story look like. This is maybe how they act, so that you can have that collective kind of idioform.
And I think that at Turnip, and I would suspect Gaslands too, which I think are go-to examples, they both started as or at least Turnip for sure did, as the kit bash. It was like kit bash first, and then rules came to describe what was happening in the kit bashes, which I think is pretty interesting. I think speaks to what you were just saying about that hook. They were like hooks first, and then the rules kind of sprung up around wanting to play with the hook.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point too, because I think a lot of what we're seeing in the community recently, or at least what I'm seeing in the communities that I'm kind of adjacent to or part of, is a lot of games like Turnip, or communities like Turnip. I think Necropolis 28 is another one where there's really kind of an idea put out there, and maybe it's like a rough draft PDF or rule set, right? Of like, here's maybe a game idea I'm thinking, but really what seems to make people kind of flock to those communities is the aesthetic hook, right? Or like the artistic kind of drive to all be part of this vision that someone has had and contribute to that world that you're kind of creating together. And they're really kind of these communities are creating these worlds collectively. It's not necessarily the design of one person, even though there may be one person kind of steering the ship and putting their name on it in the end. It's really, I think, in large part a community effort. One thing I wanted to touch on briefly, we were talking about economies of this and getting hooked into games based on, aesthetic and rules and all of this is, I wanted to put an example out there of something that's, I think, probably the farthest opposite I can think of. A great example is the original X-Wing game, Star Wars miniatures, or I believe Star Wars Legion, right? They have this concept of, it's a strong aesthetic. People love Star Wars. If you're a Star Wars person and you're a miniatures person, you probably played one of these games, right? And they sell these, in X-Wing's case, pre-painted minis. Legion, you get the joy of assembling and painting yourself, but it's very like iconic Star Wars designs. You're not really stepping outside that box. And then they take it a step further, right? Like that box comes with cards and tokens you need to play that model. And that goes into a certain type of list or army you can bring, right? And so when I was playing X-Wing competitively way back, you would see guys buy up all sorts of ships for armies they would never play, right? Just to get one card out of maybe 20 that would be in that box, right? Yeah. And it was like a huge money driver. And I think that's what like a lot of game designers, at least that I've talked to starting up, who also kind of dabble in sculpting. There's a big sense of like, I want to sculpt the miniatures I envision for this game, and I want to design the rules, and I want to release it. And I think in some cases, I want to make money off of all of it, right? Like I want to own this IP kind of end to end, which is a cool idea. But it's kind of the exact opposite of this minis agnostic idea. So it's interesting kind of dichotomy I see, because there's a lot of it and all over the community right now on both sides.
Yeah, I think another element, speaking to the minis themselves, that I think is been critical for the success of the biggest minis agnostic games out there is accessibility, right? So you look at Mordheim, you look at T28, you look at Gaslands. They say, okay, here are these objects you already probably have, right? Warhammer bits, historicals, and in the case of Gaslands, Matchbox cars. And they sort of allow you to recontextualize these things and get further life out of them in a way that makes them really attractive, right? Like if you were to make a game, a really excellent models agnostic mini war game that, required people to make all of their models or terrain out of like catalytic converters for some reason, I don't think people would play that, no matter how good the rules are. Because it is agnostic, but something about the aesthetic is requiring you to sort of go around your elbow to get to your ass, right? And so I think that's something that I find really kind of interesting and charming. And I mean, I can say, not to turn this into a plug, for my own project, Steel and Shell was something that was part of the original design, because I looked at that and I said, okay, I want to make a game where people get to kit bash stuff. But the question arises, like, okay, how do you differentiate it? And what do beginners have access to? Well, everyone has access to seashells, right? Everyone has access to these kind of spirular, shells for snails and crabs and things like that. And if you don't have any on hand, like, where to get them. Everyone knows where to get them. The same way in Gaslands, if you need a Matchbox car, there's 101 places you could get one. That I think is really valuable for bringing people, not only out to the game itself by saying, like, you already have these things, why not use them? But also bringing in people who might not already have that investment. Because for me, at least, that's been a really difficult thing about getting some of my less war game savvy friends into this stuff, is that for me, and, I help them out, but for me, it's like, I have boxes and boxes of this crap. I've got historicals, I've got, Space Marines and Bretonians and what have you, just coming out of my ears. But I think that is a barrier for models agnostic games that is actually like bordering on a downside, right? Where you have to be willing to commit to something that has an unknown window of support if you don't already have these things on hand. If you do, it's just trash into treasure. But otherwise, it can be a little tricky.
Why you end up with so many Necromunda clones? Because that trash is ubiquitous to be turned into treasure. And I think that's why I like a lot of miniature agnostic games that kind of narrowly fit an event or some like specific group running a campaign where they're like, this is when and where we're going to be using these rules and these minis, and it's clearly defined. Everybody involved knows what they're getting into when they build it for like a weekend campaign that people are traveling to or something.
Yeah.
Me and one of my best friends were designing a game, right? One of the big kind of catalysts to wanting to design the game we're working on was we have a ton of minis, like just huge amount of them, right? And we talked about giving minis new life. And this is a way where we can kind of continue to get enjoyment and repurpose a lot of what we have laying around and build a game around them, right? And use them repeatedly. I think we're trying to take it a step further, right? With our rule set and say, we switch around between game systems all the time. That's part of the fun we have is, 1 week we'll play Battlefleet Gothic, the next week we'll play Wartime, right? One of the things we're trying to do with this mini agnostic idea and the rules that are going along with it is we can really sit down and play this game with whatever kind of flavor we want to bring to the table. Now, whether or not that works out in the end, we'll see. But that was kind of the big, like I said, the big catalyst towards our design efforts that are going on right now. It's been fun. And I think, I guess to end, right, like that, at least for myself, before I jump off here, because it's fun is the whole point, right? That's why we all do this.
Head swap.